thank you for being here today for Thursday in the afternoon. Beautiful day. Spending some time with us to talk about rethinking diplomacy. I'm Giovanni Zanalda. I'm the director of the Duke Center for International Global Studies, which is the unit which deals with international studies, international programs, global studies at Duke. And of course, we collaborate with many other units across campus. A couple of years ago, I had the honor and pleasure to meet Ambassador Pearson, and we were having coffee, and we started thinking about, so what about diplomacy today? And it was one of those casual conversations that often are the best conversations to come up with new ideas. And diplomacy is, of course, a very old idea. It's not a new concept. But we introduce Ambassador Pearson more properly later. But I was really struck by his passion for not only diplomacy, but for development and for improving our societies. And we started having this conversation, and I also have the honor and pleasure to work with several diplomats, both retired or active, like Catherine Cockart, who is here. And she represents the State Department at Duke, UNC, in the region. And also Patrick Daddy, Ambassador Daddy is not here today because he's in Colombia, I think, or Peru, I don't remember. Or Ambassador Matlock, who just entered the room, who is certainly a towering figure in the field of diplomacy. So, through conversation with these retired and active diplomats, I also came up to realize that what they are doing is often unknown because, of course, we know about the shaking hands and negotiations, but there is an entire dimension in which they rely on expertise that is provided by scientists or by humanists or social scientists working in universities. And thank you, Ambassador Matlock. And so I started thinking about launching a new program called Rethinking Diplomacy, in which we combine the expertise and skills that we do have in an institution such as Duke, and with the soft skills or typical skills that are in a way what diplomats are doing. And through this conversation with scientists and colleagues in different departments and diplomats, we came up with this idea of a new program. And I had also the fortune of talking to Carol Vorhaus and the Trent Foundation, and they certainly are interested in health and international studies. And so when I proposed this idea, they enthusiastically supported, and we have a grant for 3 years that will support the program, and hopefully that will will become something else after 3 years. But we also like to start with very some programs, but then if we are successful, we will scale up. But as I said, I like to start a program knowing that we can deliver what we promise to do. So the Rethinking Diplomacy Program focuses on research that brings together diplomats, policymakers, faculty, students, and leading experts in various disciplines for academic collaboration, policy recommendations, and scholarship. The program aims to provide a forum for redefining the roles of diplomacy in an increasingly globalized and interdependent world. It also seeks to identify the skills that would enable diplomats, negotiators, and representatives of public and private institutions to address problems with cultural, regional competence, and sectoral expertise. In a way, the other reason why DUCIGS is involved in this, because we have area studies programs within the family, and having this deep knowledge of different regions of the world is an asset that we very important when we talk about diplomacy. One of the principal objectives of the program is to highlight the importance of the combination of soft skills and expertise in public health demography, environment, energy, trade, finance, and other areas in which Duke University features strong academic programs. Through the exchange of ideas, technical expertise, knowledge of all regions, and interaction with practitioners, the program prepares Duke students and fellows with skills that would enable them to succeed in pursuit of their academic goals and future careers, whether in the public service or private or international. It's up to them, it's up for grab. So, and of course, all of this will facilitate exchange of also expertise among and across departments and schools at Duke, and also with partners around the world. And the other thing I want to say before I give you the, is that by talking to colleagues, several colleagues who are some are here today came up with their own proposals, and therefore we are happy that we identify some themes that we are going to, the program will focus for at least this spring and next year, and then we are open for ideas for other themes, and also to continue some of the themes that we have identified. The other thing I would like to say about the program is very practical. Today is probably the most theoretical introduction to the program. But most of the workshops and events and activities that will be part of this program will be based on case studies, and so they will provide also practical solutions to either previous challenges and problems or current or future challenges. And we will also talk more about the connection between what we are doing with the 2030 Sustainable Development Goals. And Ambassador Pearson will talk about that. Oh, sorry. So this is, these are some of the key themes that we have identified, for which we have already organized some, we have organized workshops that will take place this spring and next year. So health diplomacy is one, water diplomacy, science diplomacy, debt finance diplomacy, diplomacy archives. I would like to say something about that when we go through the program of upcoming events. Development diplomacy, migration diplomacy, food diplomacy, environmental diplomacy. Of course, we are not going to cover everything, but these are the key themes, and we have already, as I said, we are in touch with some of our colleagues, but we also know that potentially there are other colleagues around campus and also students who are interested in some of these themes, and they will work with us in achieving or organizing some of these themes. So these are just an example of what we have in the plan for this semester. So in February we will have something about health diplomacy, which is coordinated with the Global Health Institute, and we are very happy that Daniel Ogbuabor is coming from Nigeria as a fellow DGHI for a couple of months, and we are working with them to highlight some of his work, and also to make sure that we will interact with him and other in the field of health diplomacy. Then April the 2nd, I would say, is probably the most traditional part of diplomacy, in the sense that it's part of what we are also doing at DUCIGS. We have the Biddle Lecture in International Studies, and Ambassador Nick Burns, who is one of the most distinguished ambassadors or retired ambassadors in the US, is also a professor at Harvard and the director of the Future of Diplomacy Program. So he will come for the lecture, but also he will spend some time with us in comparing notes. It's a very different program, but that is why we would like to compare notes. Then we will have something on science diplomacy, which is a growing field. We have two representatives here, Bill Pan and Chris Lara, who are also certified to teach about science diplomacy. So through their expertise, and we are going to have a workshop on science diplomacy. And then in April, we will, this is why I said I wanted to say something about the library. I'm very grateful that the library has been extremely receptive to this idea. So we are going to have an event in which the chief archivist and of the World Bank Group, Elizabeth Liberatori, will come and deliver a talk on development diplomacy / international diplomacy and archives. And the Rubenstein Library and Perkins have already prepared a new website within the library website, in which they have highlighted collections that have to do with diplomacy, including, of course, Ambassador Matlock's collection. And so, in a way, we want to make sure that it's not only about diplomacy and science, diplomacy, health diplomacy, etc., but we also want to make sure that students and scholars and researchers know that we have a series of amazing collections and the library, and hopefully more and more students will use it in the future. We will also organize next year with the library a series of workshops on human rights and connected to the collections that we have here in the library, and so human rights and diplomacy using libraries' resources. In the fall, we are going to have one of the first workshops on water diplomacy, which will have to do with hydrodiplomacy and hydropolitics, with Christine Folch and invited speaker from Africa and Asia to compare notes about different dam projects in the three continents. We will have a development diplomacy public lecture by a very distinguished speaker from the UN. And then we will also organize a workshop on environmental peace building in Colombia. And it's going to be a 1 or maybe 2 day conference. And Erika Weinthal and other researchers are going to be involved in that. This is just the beginning, so we will have more, and it's not just about events. There are going to be publications, videos, and documentaries that we will work on in the future. Thank you very much for being patient with me, because then, of course, we are here for him. But I want to say that let me just go back. As I said, thank you very much to the Joshua Charles Trent Memorial Foundation Endowment Fund for making this possible. Thank you for the DUCIGS team, in particular Ping and Nancy, Renata, Erin, and others, Nancy, who is there. And I want to say, Nancy, at the end of when you leave the room, she has flyers for the Nick Burns event. So just as a reminder, you will receive invitations, etc., but she has already some flyers for the April the 2nd public lecture. So, and there are several friends who are here. I want to thank all of them. As I said, Carol Vorhaus, Alexander de Havilland from the Trent Foundation, the board, and the Rubenstein Library. Now, Ambassador Pearson. Yeah, I like to talk, like my students know. So I will be very short, because otherwise I can spend another hour just telling you about all the appointments that Ambassador Pearson and Maggie Pearson, who is also a very distinguished diplomat, held all around the world. But I want just to say that Ambassador Pearson is a retired diplomat who served as a US ambassador to Turkey from 2000 to 2003. And as I said, he served in China, NATO, and France. Every time I mention a country, I discover that they were there. I don't know how it's possible, but that is. And but also, and this is very important for our purpose, he was Director General of the U.S. Foreign Service for several years, and under his leadership, he repositioned the American Foreign Service to meet the new challenges of the 21st century, and for that he won 2 national awards for this effort. He also served from 2008 to 2014, after his retirement, as president of IREX, an international development NGO based in Washington. spearheading its expansion to reach more than 125 countries worldwide. He's currently the president of American Diplomacy Publishers and the DUCIGS, we are extremely honored, Rethinking Diplomacy Fellow. In fact, he's our first fellow. And we also have others who are here. He appears often on BBC, CNBC, NPR, Al Jazeera, I24 TV, TNT Global, and other networks. I don't see Fox. He's a frequent speaker on issues concerning Turkey, international development, and the role of diplomacy in American engagement abroad. Ambassador Pearson, thank you very much for being here.
Thank you very much, Giovanni, for that wonderful and generous introduction. I'm really delighted to be here tonight. Someone told me in the back that for a non-musical event, this had a pretty good attendance. So I don't sing, and if I did, it would probably empty the room. But in any case, I'm delighted to have you here tonight because this is a very exciting topic. Before I start, I would like to extend a special welcome to the Consul General of Mexico, who is with us tonight, and thank you very much, Madam Consul General, and to Catherine Crockert, who is the diplomat in residence here at Duke, and I will say in a very large geography. I have no idea how she covers all the schools and all the people she has to talk to, but she's doing a splendid job, and when she came to this job, she just left being the acting ambassador in our embassy in Pakistan, so you know what an incredible career she's had and how important it is that she be one of the people representing the American people here as a diplomat in residence. Ambassador Matlock, I had the pleasure and honor of working with as the Soviet Union was dissolving, and he's written a wonderful book and has a wonderful history about that, and that is one of the most successful experiences in American diplomacy, I'm sure, in our history. So it was a wonderful achievement. Jack, very happy that you're here tonight. And I would like to also just introduce my wife, Maggie, who's a professional diplomat of 27 years experience. She was a public affairs officer, and so whenever I would stand up to say something, Maggie would be able to explain what I meant. And so she has been an indispensable partner for me for all our professional careers. I want to thank the Trent Foundation. I certainly want to thank the Center for International and Global Studies here at Duke for this series, which I think is marvelous. You know, there's a story about Duke that I especially like. About 120 years ago, Duke was involved in a serious controversy over race relations. And the trustees of the university in 1903 took an unequivocal stand in favor of academic freedom. And when President Teddy Roosevelt came down to visit Duke a few years later, he pointed out this achievement and praised it, and he said something I'd like us all to remember. He said that the duty to speak out is more incumbent on the scholar than on anyone else. So it's in that spirit that I want to talk to you tonight, the importance and the obligation to tell the truth and to be the truth in advancing the disciplines of diplomacy and science. So the world we look at today and for the foreseeable future is more complicated, has greater issues with greater scope, and with more importance than probably at any other time in human history. And there is a greater urgency to solving these problems than has ever been true, I believe, and certainly in modern times. So rethinking diplomacy in the face of these realities requires a new look at the tools we use that help us move forward. And we are going to talk about goals to advance human progress. Many of you may already know the Millennium Development Goals, the results of which were announced in 2015, but there were really some astonishing achievements made between 1990 and 2015. People living in abject global poverty, that's below $1.25 a day, according to the standard at the time, fell by more than half. And a great deal of that progress was made in China by China. The child mortality rate in the world was reduced by more than 50%. The maternal mortality rate was reduced by nearly 50%. 2.6 billion people gained access to improved drinking water. Primary school enrollment passed 90%. Gender enrollment made tremendous progress. Malaria mortality rate fell by 60%. TB mortality rate fell by nearly 50%. And official development assistance, that is government supplied development assistance, rose by nearly 2/3. So the Sustainable Development Goals build on that progress. And while we hear talk about how America needs to be great, one of the things I'm going to emphasize to you tonight is that we are great, and we have been great. And these accomplishments were not all ours alone by any means, but they are a result of our leadership and our devotion to these principles. But success in the Sustainable Development Goal depends on an absolutely uncountable number of smaller projects that are being carried out, including those that Professor Alda has talked to you about tonight. So it's in linking those projects to the Sustainable Development Goals that inspires us and gives us confidence about the future. I want to talk about these things tonight with you. I'm going to briefly mention the American approach to diplomacy. I'm going to talk about how diplomacy represents fundamental human incentives. We think of diplomacy as being something that only goes on at the stratospheric level, but I guarantee you that all of you have been engaged in diplomacy all day today, and you will tomorrow, and diplomacy is entirely about interrelationships between people and how to accomplish things peacefully. I'm going to talk about, give you some comments of what I think good diplomacy consists of. I'm going to offer you a proposal for a better model to deal with complicated problems, including those where there's a factual basis for science. And we're going to look at that model in practice very briefly, and then I'm going to close with some comments on the role of universities, students, and faculty in the academic village. In American culture, we've often downplayed diplomacy as in our narrative, and we have never really emphasized it. And part of that reason goes back as far as the Jacksonian Revolution in 1828, when we developed this ethic that we didn't need a lot of additional information. A man or woman on the frontier could handle their problems and do anything, and that created the idea that I'm sure at least the older generation has heard all their lives, and that is that anyone could be president of the United States. And now we've proven it. So this anti-intellectual strain in American culture is one of the difficulties for understanding how diplomacy and science should work. And I won't, just let me mention a couple of things. Think of the frontier experience in that conflict at the frontier line going west for 3 centuries, from the early 17th century to the early 20th century, gave our country the idea that force and violence was the only way by which things were achieved in the popular mind. It wasn't true in real history, but it was in the popular mind. And then let me just give you one more example with World War II. World War II was indeed the most enormous victory of American power and American influence in our national history. And we glorify the exploits of our fighting men and women, and we rid ourselves of a monstrous evil. But we kind of forgot what the diplomacy did. Do you know that as a result of World War II, the United States led the effort to end colonialism in the world? And we succeeded. It took us a while, but we did it. We also created the idea of collective security, where countries didn't have to arm themselves against everybody. They would collectively be able to have just enough power to act together and be no threat to their neighbors and a safeguard against external threats. And the most astonishing thing we did, in 1950, the world GNP was $9.25 trillion. Last year, it was over $90 trillion. Never in human history has that much wealth been created in that short a period of time. And of course, the Americans didn't do this by themselves. They did it with lots of other people. That's the way you do things. But that kind of achievement is hardly ever spoken of in our history. I don't mind that we glorify the victories of wars, but I would like to see us understand that it was the diplomacy after those wars that created the framework that made these successes possible. Just mention one more thing. You know, culturally, we are an action-oriented society. We're not very patient. People like Dwayne Johnson and Sylvester Stallone and Tom Cruise and John Wayne, for us in the older generation, they become the iconic American heroes for what the American way is. And we like this winner-take-all sort of approach. So we don't give enough room in our own society to the fruits of diplomacy to make a difference in our lives. So I want to talk a little bit about how diplomacy does represent fundamental human incentives. We think of diplomacy as something having been created in the halls of Europe, mainly because of historical references, and we think of diplomacy as something that's only carried out in capitals. But let me explain a little bit more, if I can, about why it's part of every one of us and why it's completely natural to the human experience. So I don't know, have any of you ever played Prisoner's Dilemma? In that theory, have you ever played Prisoner's Dilemma? Well, in Prisoner's Dilemma, which is a game theory game, two people are arrested for a crime. And each one of them they are separated so they cannot possibly communicate. And each one of them is told that they will get a lesser punishment if they rat on the other guy. So they do, usually. That's the way the game is played. But for diplomatic purposes, if those two people had had a chance to communicate, they would have worked out a much better deal. So we can take this truth as rock bottom in human society, that with communication, people can and do seek out a better solution than the one they would have picked if they were not able to communicate with each other. And we can expand that to include any number of people in theory. And what happens is that with a win, you get the prestige and status of having won. You get the enthusiasm, you get the confidence of dealing with new goals, and you see how this selfish gene, which we all have, to maximize our individual benefits. I see a lot of heads nodding, so I'm glad you're with me on this. So to maximize our individual benefits can be transformed into an unselfish outcome. And that's what communication allows us to do, and that's what diplomacy is about. I was a young diplomat with a guy named Richard Holbrooke back in 1976, when the world had an enormous refugee crisis when South Vietnam fell and the Khmer Rouge invaded Cambodia. And under his pressure, because he was that kind of guy, and I was one of his personal aides, the U.S. picked up refugees at sea. They created resettlement camps. There was a convention in Geneva to explain to the world the need to accept these refugees. And in a few years, the U.S. had tripled the number of Vietnamese refugees it took in to 1.5 million. And we had a successful result that was able to combine the needs of individual nations to satisfy their interests and the global need to find homes for Vietnamese refugees, many of whom in this country have contributed mightily to our own culture. So let's take a look at what I would call good diplomacy. Okay? So picture a Venn diagram. Two circles, many circles if you wish, but populate all those circles with the values and interests of each group inside that circle. And you will find that those circles overlap. And where they intersect, you find the common values and the common interests and the common principles that those groups share. And in diplomacy, you start there. You start there. And that, even if it's a tiny little area, you start there and you find ways to try to build on that space and expand it. When you do that, in good diplomacy, you start out with the presentation that is most likely to get other people to agree with you. And that means that you start out with a presentation that also helps them think that their goals might be reached as well. It doesn't mean you're about to give up on your own goals. It means you present them in such a way that they can see that there's common space and that we have a chance to work something out. When you find those easiest ones, then you keep expanding that space to build confidence in the entire group. The second principle is also counterintuitive for most people, and that is that listening is far more important than speaking in diplomacy. Most people know without even thinking exactly what their position is on any subject under the sun. And if you enjoy dormitory discussions on Saturday night about how to solve the problems of the world, you see this in action all the time, right? But listening allows you to do something even more importantly, and that is to hear the words, watch the body language, remember what wasn't said, remember the order in which things were said, remember what other people in the delegation were doing while these things were said, and so you learn about what the other side's interests and concerns are, and you concentrate on that in order to find out whether you can have some common ground to work toward. And also, it's important that you be as patient as time permits. Diplomacy is not a 1 year or even a 1 decade discipline. Think of Northern Ireland. The Irish Revolution started in 1916. We are still trying to figure out how the geography of Ireland can come to a settlement that is peaceful and harmonious and that endures through time. Think of the Arab-Israeli conflict. It's been going on for 100 years as well. Some scholars say that democracy didn't even come to Europe until 1945. We had the French Revolution. We had the Great Revolution of 1848, which was totally crushed by monarchies and authoritarian leaders. And it took 2 world wars to bring Europe to the point where the citizens' voices were in fact predominant in the governance of their cultures. It takes a long time. And sometimes, if you're good at diplomacy, then it can lead to a spirit of reconciliation. In Bosnia, and I personally worked as the head of our international NGO in Liberia after a 20-year civil war to begin to try to knit the country back together. And in Rwanda, after the great genocide of 1994. I worked there, of course, more than a decade later, but we had a National Reconciliation Commission, and we worked with them to try to build new lives. People aren't going to leave the country. They're going to have to live with each other forever, and so in certain circumstances, reconciliation can work. There are, let me turn to negotiating models if I can. There are a lot of negotiating models. If you've studied this, you will know that I'm going to reduce all of them down to one that I'm going to talk to you about. And that is called the collaboration model. What I like about the collaboration model is that it focuses less on conflict and more on cooperation. It's been tried before with success. It can be used both to resolve issues and to protect values. It can provide partial interim solutions. It fits various configurations of groups that include the private sector, non-government, government, citizens, and associations. And it can accommodate relative power relationships. It can incorporate on an international level, when that's the problem, international law and practice, and it has the power to deliver more durable solutions. If you solve a problem by by conversation instead of confrontation, your solution will last a lot longer and be much more successful. And that's why diplomats enjoy the work they do. And finally, the collaboration model also reflects the basic democratic principle that authority rests on the consent of the governed. This is the dramatic idea of the American Revolution, which was designed to introduce a new idea into the world. Nobody thought we would succeed. Nobody thought we would ever make it. And we did with our ideas of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. So that's another reason, of course, why I'm passionate about the collaboration model. Let me ask you to take a look at some of these practices, some of these actual practices and successes. I think that the most successful, the largest, and the most consequential use of a collaboration model in modern human history is the Ozone Treaty of 1987. Fluorocarbons were being produced, chlorofluorocarbons, I believe is the correct term, were being produced that were destroying the ozone layer at the poles. And so over a period of 2 years, using data that had been assembled to show the damage to the ozone layer, chemical producers, countries, the UN, the scientific community, and environmental NGO groups came together to solve this problem, and it has all but disappeared from our environmental list of things to be concerned about. Coming back to a smaller scale, and in the United States in the 1970s, there was a small-sized city that was beginning to lose investment because of tensions over racial differences regarding housing. So in that case, a committee was formed that put together realtors, appraisers, lenders, citizens, and other concerned people to come up with a solution. But again, the key element to that process was the data that, in this case, citizens put together in order to demonstrate the impact of a failure to address a critical problem in the housing problem in this city, and it turned out to be very successful. In the Netherlands, in about 2000, there was a large Dutch bank which had already committed to investment in agribusiness and sustainable food enterprises. And it teamed with an NGO in the Netherlands to create a green credit card. And so that bank had been investing in non-sustainable industries. It gave that up with the theory that it would gain more in reputation by aligning itself with the green credit card than it would by trying to maximize its profits across a mixture of enterprises, and it succeeded. And there again, there was a major study that showed the data, that presented the data, that indicated that this could be an achievable goal, and it showed what happened to non-sustainable industries over time, and therefore gave an enormous boost to the project. And so today, there are 101 financial institutions around the world in 38 countries that support the so-called Equator Principles, which are principles designed to balance environmental and social risk in development projects. And in this country, people like the Bank of America, Citigroup, J.P. Morgan, Wells Fargo, and others are members of this effort. So rather than make you think I'm giving you the Disney version of the collaborative model, let me tell you about at least one major failure. So in what I've described, there are really 5 elements that are absolutely required. You have to have the stakeholders, you have to have a definition of the problem, you have to have a commitment to dialogue, you have to have then a commitment to a solution, and you have to carry out a solution that is durable. Monsanto is the poster child of the failure I'm going to describe to you. Monsanto invented Roundup. Monsanto manufactured Agent Orange. Monsanto developed a growth hormone for cattle. Monsanto engineered soybeans that would resist Roundup. Then Monsanto asked to impose this GMO regime on the rest of the world. Maggie and I were diplomats in Paris in the early 2000s when this happened. And the French absolutely, we got nowhere. We got nowhere. And of course, all I had to do was explain behind doors what Monsanto hoped to do, but Maggie had to explain it in public, so her job was a lot harder than mine. But if you could have looked at this problem, what to do with the ability to genetically modified food products in the 1970s, you would definitely have picked a better way to do it than Monsanto picked by commercializing the entire idea and marketing it as something that would be profit-making and beneficial to people. So just this last week, the New York Times Magazine had an article entitled Unnatural Selection about gene manipulation, and they quote Dr. Todd Kuiken over at the Genetic Engineering and Society Center at NC State, who said that he thought this whole history was a lesson in how not to do things, and called on people to develop a more transparent and collaborative model to handle these kinds of problems. So we are now 10 years away from the end date for the 17 Sustainable Development Goals. These goals put a lot of emphasis on societal goals as well as what they call biosphere goals, that is public health, clean water, safe food, and the like. And I think there were some people who, even though the Millennium Goals were really successful, somehow felt that they hadn't done enough. And I suspect that in the Sustainable Development Goals, they have 17 of those, as I mentioned. There were only 8 Millennium Goals. And so I wonder if the proliferation of goals may not pose another challenge to the success that people are hoping for. Personally, as a diplomat trying to find pragmatic solutions, I would have preferred something that concentrated on urgent goals and achievable goals, some combination to make that. And if I had a suggestion for the Duke program, it would be just that. Focus on what's achievable, focus on what's urgent, and show the world what's relevant, and give the world confidence that those other goals can be reached. So there are always challenges to success. Truth is elusive, knowledge is imperfect, things happen, but I want to just quote back to you what Margaret Mead said, and I'm sure you've heard her famous dictum, but it's very important in this enterprise especially. Here's what she said: never doubt that a small group of thoughtful, committed citizens can change the world. Never doubt that a small group of citizens can change the world. Indeed, she says, that's the only thing that ever has. If you think about it, every new idea begins with one person or people acting separately. Every new idea has to attract other people who also support it. And therefore, constructive change is always a minority view. It has to be a minority view because it is that leverage, that force that causes conventional wisdom to have to make room for it. And this is forever work. As long as we inhabit this blue globe, this blue dot, then every success and every failure will create new obstacles that have to be overcome. We need to think about that in terms of the human species over an indefinite period of time, and not trying to solve the next 3 or 4 problems in front of us and think that we have reached some level of nirvana. Just say a few words about universities and Duke. In my opinion, this is exactly the kind of challenge that is worthy of a generation of students with the best access to education and the best resources in any preceding generation, certainly in American history. So yes, the issues are more significant, they're more complicated, but the skill sets to resolve those issues are more diverse, they're more interconnected, and potentially they are more powerful than any before it. So I give to you three things: science in all its dimensions, the ability through positive social networking to create a global voice for global problems. I'm thinking of Greta Thunberg here as a prime example, and the greater use of collaboration models of diplomacy collectively to give us a powerful platform for constructive change. In today's world, as we know, all science is also politics. Knowing what is right to do is not enough to solve a problem. It's knowing how to take what is right to do and convince a public, a government, a citizenry that this is what they would like to do. That is the challenge. And for me, that means that science and diplomacy are indispensable partners to human progress. And there's a unique role here for universities. There are think tanks within and outside universities all over this country and all over the world who address serious problems in their view of national security and other major issues and try to find solutions to them. But I don't know of any other university that has a goal of using diplomacy and science together to promote projects that advance humankind towards the goals that the Sustainable Development Goals represent for us. This decade, 2020, on its way to 2030, this decade that we are just beginning puts Duke in a position of leadership to help rethink diplomacy in service to science, to add to human progress. And whether this is done is really up to you. The billions of people in this generation and those coming behind you wish you every success. Thank you very much.